"72 years old and still scrubbing floors in someone else's house," Lauren said lightly, her voice carrying over the laughter of her guests. And for a moment the room froze around Evelyn Parker as if the words had weight. Evelyn stood in the marble hallway of her son's mansion with a damp cloth in her hand, the faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her skin, her back slightly bent not from weakness, but from years of habit, from a lifetime of cleaning kitchens and wiping tables and doing what needed to be done without asking for praise. The laughter didn't explode. It trickled out in polite bursts, the kind meant to smooth over discomfort, and Evelyn felt it brush past her like a cold draft. She didn't look up right away. She didn't rush to explain that she was the mother of the homeowner, that she wasn't hired help, that this house existed because of decades she had spent packing lunches, sewing hems, and standing on her feet for 10 hours a day so her son could one day walk into rooms like this with confidence. Instead, she focused on the faint streak on the polished floor that caught the afternoon light from the tall windows overlooking the backyard, a yard bigger than the entire lot where she had raised Michael. The guests were gathered near the kitchen island, wine glasses in hand, dressed in clean lines and muted colors, people who spoke casually about property values and travel times as if distance were a small inconvenience instead of a barrier Evelyn had rarely crossed. Someone shifted awkwardly. Someone else pretended to check their phone. Lauren smiled, perfectly at ease, her hand resting on the counter as if she had merely made an observation about the weather. Evelyn straightened slowly, her knees reminding her of the miles they had carried her through factories and diners and school hallways, and she nodded once, not toward Lauren but toward the floor, as if acknowledging a task completed. She had arrived that morning before the guests, after Lauren mentioned in passing that the house needed to look presentable, and Evelyn had agreed without hesitation, the way she always did, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she was helping, telling herself that being useful meant being welcome. The mansion was quiet then, almost echoing, its rooms filled with furniture chosen for style, rather than comfort. And as Evelyn moved from room to room, she couldn't help noticing how little of Michael existed here beyond framed photographs and a few personal items tucked away in drawers. By the time the guests arrived, the floors shone, the counters were spotless, and Evelyn had retreated to the edges, careful not to be in the way, careful not to remind anyone that she didn't quite belong. Now, standing in the open with that single sentence hanging in the air, she felt something shift inside her, not sharp, not loud, but solid, like a door closing gently but firmly. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass of a display cabinet, a small white-haired woman in sensible shoes, and she thought of the house where Michael had grown up, less than 1,200 square feet, where she had scrubbed linoleum floors late at night after he fell asleep, where no one had laughed because no one had been watching. Michael was there somewhere, she knew that, moving through the crowd, refilling glasses, nodding along to conversations, and she waited for his voice, not raised, not angry, just present, but it didn't come. The silence stretched, thin and telling. Evelyn placed the cloth carefully on the counter, smoothing it flat with deliberate care, and stepped back, her hands empty now, her posture straighter than before, as if the weight she had been carrying had finally been set down, though no one else in the room seemed to notice what had just changed. After the laughter thinned and conversations resumed, Evelyn moved quietly to the side of the room, positioning herself near the tall window where the light softened the sharp edges of the space and made her feel less exposed. She folded her hands together, noticing how the skin on them looked almost translucent against the dark wood of the windowsill, and she listened as the guests spoke about renovations, about commute times, about a recent property that sold for more than $3 million only a few blocks away. No one addressed her directly, and that absence was loud in a way that pressed against her chest. Lauren drifted past her once, heels clicking lightly on the floor Evelyn had just finished cleaning, and offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile reserved for people who were useful but easily overlooked. Michael passed by shortly after, carrying a tray of glasses, his expression neutral, his gaze sliding past his mother as if she were part of the furniture, and in that moment Evelyn understood that the silence was not accidental. It had been chosen. She remembered how earlier that morning she had arrived with a small overnight bag, careful to set it neatly in the guest room she had been assigned, a room that felt more like a hotel than a place meant for rest, with stiff pillows and artwork that said nothing about the people who lived there. Lauren had mentioned the gathering casually while checking her phone, saying it would be nice if the house looked fresh, and Evelyn had nodded, telling herself that contributing meant belonging. That effort was a form of love that did not require acknowledgement. As she stood there now, she replayed small moments she had brushed aside before, the way Lauren referred to the house as hers when speaking to friends, the way Evelyn was introduced only by her first name, the way her chair was always placed slightly away from the main table during dinners. None of it had seemed sharp enough to cut on its own, but together it formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. The guests began moving toward the backyard, drawn by the view and the mild afternoon weather, and the room emptied slowly, leaving behind the faint scent of perfume and citrus cleaner. Evelyn took a breath she had not realized she was holding and walked toward the kitchen sink, rinsing the cloth she had used earlier, watching the water run clear before hanging it neatly over the edge. The motion felt final in a way she could not yet explain. She glanced around the kitchen, at the high-end appliances and the smooth counters, and thought of the small apartment she had lived in after Michael left for college, where the refrigerator hummed too loudly and the windows rattled in winter, and where she had never once felt smaller than she did standing in this spotless room. She dried her hands slowly, deliberately, as if marking time, then made her way down the hallway toward the guest room. Along the way, she noticed details she had missed before, framed photographs where she appeared only once or twice at the edges, her presence cropped or faded. Into the background, reminders that she had been included only when convenient. Inside the guest room, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and removed her shoes, setting them side by side with care, a habit she had kept for decades. She rested her palms on her knees and allowed the quiet to settle around her, the muffled sound of laughter drifting in from outside through the closed door. There was no rush in her movements now, no sense of urgency to prove her worth or fill the silence. For the first time since arriving, Evelyn did not reach for something to clean or fix or improve. She simply sat, her back straight, her expression calm, and let a single, steady thought take shape, clear and undeniable, that whatever this place was, whatever role she had been given here, it was not the life she had earned, and she would not shrink herself any further to fit inside it. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the mansion settled into a quiet that felt staged rather than peaceful, Evelyn remained in the guest room, listening to the distant hum of the air conditioning and the faint echo of Michael's voice drifting from downstairs as he spoke with Lauren. The door was not fully closed, and she did not try to make out the words, only the tone, light and untroubled, the sound of a life that did not require her presence. She rose slowly and opened her small overnight bag, taking out a neatly folded cardigan and placing it on the chair, then smoothing the bedspread even though it was already perfectly arranged. These motions had always steadied her, small acts of order that made the world feel manageable. As she moved, memories surfaced without warning, not dramatic or painful, just persistent, like background noise she could no longer ignore. She remembered Michael at 8 years old, sitting at a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on it, working through math problems while she cooked dinner and listened with half an ear, correcting him gently, without ever making him feel small. She remembered the day she signed the loan papers that helped him start his first business, her hands shaking not from doubt, but from the weight of responsibility, knowing she was putting her own modest savings at risk because she believed in him without question. Downstairs, a laugh rang out, Lauren's voice clear and confident, and Evelyn paused, one hand resting on the back of the chair. She realized then that the laugh no longer startled her. It no longer cut. Instead, it clarified. She stepped into the hallway and walked slowly toward the staircase, her steps light, not intending to interrupt, only to observe. From the landing, she could see the kitchen, now spotless, and Lauren leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone while Michael poured himself a drink. They spoke about schedules, about an upcoming trip, about a contractor coming by next week, plans layered neatly one on top of the other, none of them including Evelyn. She watched Michael nod, watched him smile. The same expression he wore when he was younger and asking for something he hoped would be granted. When Lauren mentioned that the guest room might be needed soon for friends coming to stay, Michael agreed without hesitation, his voice easy, agreeable. Evelyn felt the final piece settle into place. This was not confusion or thoughtlessness. It was alignment. She returned to the guest room without a sound and sat down again, her posture relaxed, her breathing even. There was no rush now to confront or explain. She did not feel the urge to justify her place or remind anyone of what she had done. Instead, she thought about her own house, the small one-bedroom she still owned outright, the one with the creaky steps and the neighbors who waved when they saw her come and go. She thought about the envelope in her purse containing documents she had updated quietly months ago, changes she had made after noticing how easily she was overlooked, adjustments that felt prudent at the time and now felt necessary. Evelyn stood and looked around the guest room one last time, not with resentment, but with a calm assessment, as if she were checking out of a hotel she would not be returning to. She placed her shoes back into her bag, folded the cardigan once more, and zipped it closed with care. When she turned off the light and stepped back into the hallway, she did so without hesitation, her movements unhurried, her mind clear. Downstairs, the conversation continued, uninterrupted, unaware that something had shifted upstairs that could not be undone, a quiet decision made not in anger, but in understanding, and Evelyn walked toward it with a steadiness she had earned over a lifetime. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through the tall windows of the guest room, and Evelyn woke before anyone else in the house, her body still tuned to decades of early mornings that did not allow for lingering in bed. She sat up slowly, listening to the distant sounds of the mansion coming to life, the low hum of appliances, the faint footsteps of Lauren moving downstairs, and she felt a strange calm settle over her. The kind that comes after a long internal argument has finally ended. She dressed neatly, choosing simple clothes that felt like her own rather than the borrowed softness of the guest linens, and she packed her bag with the same care she always used, aligning edges, smoothing fabric, leaving no trace behind. When she stepped into the hallway, the house felt different in daylight, less impressive, more exposed, and she noticed how easy it was to see which spaces were meant to be lived in and which were meant to be admired. In the kitchen, Lauren stood by the counter with a cup of coffee, scrolling through messages, barely glancing up as Evelyn entered, and Michael sat at the island reading something on his phone, his expression distant and distracted. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the previous evening, and that absence confirmed what Evelyn already knew. She poured herself a glass of water, her movement steady, and leaned lightly against the counter, observing without judgment as Lauren spoke about her plans for the day, mentioning errands and appointments, her tone efficient and dismissive. Michael nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, never once looking toward his mother as if to include her in the conversation. Evelyn took a sip of water and remembered other mornings long ago, when Michael would sit at a small kitchen table waiting for breakfast, when she would ask about his day and listen carefully, making space for his worries and plans because that was what mothers did. The memory did not bring sadness this time, only clarity. When Lauren finally looked up and noticed Evelyn standing there, she paused briefly, then asked, in a polite but firm voice, whether Evelyn needed a ride somewhere later, phrasing it as an accommodation rather than an invitation. Evelyn smiled faintly and shook her head, saying she had her own plans. And for the first time Lauren seemed unsure, as if the answer had disrupted an expected script. Michael glanced up then, surprised, and asked where she was going, his tone casual, as if assuming she would explain herself. Evelyn met his eyes calmly and said she was heading home, that she had things to take care of, and she did not elaborate. There was a moment of silence, brief but noticeable, before Michael responded with a nod, telling her to let them know if she needed anything, already returning his attention to his phone. Lauren resumed her scrolling, satisfied. Evelyn picked up her bag and walked toward the door, pausing only to look once more at the kitchen she had cleaned so carefully the day before, the spotless surfaces now bearing the early signs of use, fingerprints and crumbs appearing almost immediately. She realized then how quickly effort disappeared when it was not valued. At the door, she slipped on her shoes and stepped outside, the cool morning air grounding her in a way the mansion never had. She walked down the long driveway at an unhurried pace, the sound of her footsteps steady and even, and as she reached the sidewalk, she did not look back. The house behind her continued its routines without interruption, unaware that something essential had quietly removed itself from its orbit, and Evelyn moved forward with a lightness she had not felt in years, carrying with her not resentment, but the quiet certainty that she would no longer make herself small to fit into someone else's idea of her worth. The drive back to her small house took just under 30 minutes, and Evelyn spent it in silence, the radio off, her hands steady on the wheel as familiar streets replaced the manicured lanes near her son's neighborhood. When she pulled into her driveway, the sight of her modest home brought an unexpected sense of relief, not because it was impressive but because it was honest. She stepped inside and set her bag down by the door, breathing in the faint scent of old wood and clean laundry, a smell that belonged to her alone. The house greeted her with quiet creaks and soft light, and for the first time in days, she did not feel like a guest waiting to be tolerated. Evelyn moved through the room slowly, touching the back of a chair, straightening a framed photograph, grounding herself in the reality she had built long before the mansion ever existed. She brewed a cup of coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, the same one where she had once helped Michael with homework, where bills had been paid and decisions made without anyone watching or judging. As she sat there, she allowed herself to think carefully, not emotionally, about what came next. The memory of the laughter from the previous day surfaced again, but it no longer carried the sting it once had. Instead, it felt like a signal she had ignored for too long. Evelyn rose and retrieved a slim folder from a drawer in her bedroom, one she had organized months earlier during a quiet afternoon when she first sensed that her role in her son's life was shifting. Inside were neatly arranged documents, updated beneficiary forms, a revised will, notes from a brief consultation she had scheduled and attended alone without telling anyone. At the time, it had felt like a precaution, something sensible rather than dramatic. Now, holding the folder, she understood it as preparation. She did not rush. She reviewed each page carefully, confirming details, making sure everything reflected her intentions clearly. There was no anger in her movements, only certainty. Later that afternoon, her phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and she let it ring once before answering, her voice calm and even. He asked if she had made it home safely, his tone polite, almost formal, and she said yes, thanking him without adding more. He mentioned that Lauren hoped she had not felt uncomfortable, framing the comment as an afterthought, and Evelyn replied that everything was clear now, that she appreciated the hospitality. There was a pause on the line, a brief hesitation, as if Michael sensed something he could not quite identify, but he did not ask. When the call ended, Evelyn set the phone down gently and looked around her kitchen again, noticing how the afternoon light filled the space without needing permission. In the days that followed, she returned to her routines, attending her weekly appointment at the community center, meeting a neighbor for lunch, watering the small patch of flowers she had planted herself. She did not reach out to Michael, and he did not reach out to her, a mutual quiet settling between them that spoke louder than arguments ever could. One afternoon, as she sorted through old mail, Evelyn came across a photograph of Michael as a child, smiling widely, unaware of futures and expectations, and she studied it for a long moment before placing it back where it belonged. She understood now that love did not require self-erasure, that support did not mean silence in the face of disrespect. As evening approached, she sat on her porch with a glass of water, watching the sky shift colors, feeling neither bitter nor triumphant, but resolved. The world had not ended because she stepped away from a place that diminished her. Instead, something quieter and stronger had taken root, a sense of ownership over her remaining years, and Evelyn knew that whatever came next would be shaped by her choices, not by laughter she was never meant to endure. Weeks passed with a steadiness that surprised Evelyn, each day unfolding without drama, yet carrying a quiet sense of momentum she had not felt in years. She settled back into her routines fully, volunteering twice a week at the local library, attending a morning walking group that met near the park, and rediscovering the comfort of conversations that did not require her to explain herself. Her phone remained mostly silent, except for brief messages from neighbors and reminders for appointments, and she did not check it with the anxious anticipation she once reserved for her son's calls. When Michael finally reached out again, it was on a Sunday afternoon, his voice careful, as though testing the temperature of the water before stepping in. He asked how she was doing, mentioned that work had been busy, that the house felt quieter without guests, and Evelyn listened without interrupting, noting how his words circled around the obvious without touching it. She replied that she was well, that she had been keeping busy, and that she hoped he was taking care of himself, her tone warm but measured. There was a pause, longer than before, and Michael admitted that Lauren had been confused by her sudden distance, that she had assumed Evelyn needed time, but did not understand why things felt different now. Evelyn did not correct him. She did not revisit the laughter or the comment or the silence that followed. Instead, she said calmly that clarity often feels uncomfortable at first, that sometimes stepping back is the kindest way to see things as they are. Michael did not argue, but he did not agree either, and the call ended with polite goodbyes that felt more like closure than connection. Afterward, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table and reflected on how easily she had once filled every silence for others, smoothing edges, offering reassurance, carrying emotional weight that was never acknowledged. Now, she allowed the silence to exist, trusting it to do its work. A few days later, she attended a small luncheon at the community center, seated among women who spoke openly about their lives, their disappointments, their boundaries, and Evelyn found herself listening with a recognition that felt both sobering and empowering. One woman spoke about learning too late that love without respect erodes quietly. Another about reclaiming time she had given away freely, and Evelyn understood she was not alone in her awakening. That evening, she reviewed her folder once more, not to change anything, but to confirm that it still aligned with who she was becoming. Satisfied, she placed it back in the drawer and locked it, the sound soft but decisive. The following week, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. He stood at her front door with a tentative smile, holding a small box of pastries as if it might bridge a gap he could not name. Evelyn welcomed him in, offering coffee, and they sat across from each other at the same table where so much of his childhood had unfolded. He looked around the room, taking in the simplicity, the familiarity, and for a moment his expression softened. He spoke about the house, about pressure, about expectations that seemed to grow the more he tried to meet them, and Evelyn listened, truly listened, without rushing to fix or soothe. When he finished, she said gently that success should never require the erasure of those who helped build it, that dignity is not negotiable, and that she would no longer accept being diminished to make others comfortable. Michael looked down, absorbing her words, and nodded slowly, not in full understanding, but in recognition that something had changed. When he left, Evelyn stood at the door and watched him walk to his car, feeling no triumph, only peace. She closed the door and returned to her quiet home, aware that her choice to step back had not been an act of loss, but one of preservation, and that the respect she sought would now be measured not by what she endured, but by what she refused to accept. The change did not announce itself loudly, but Evelyn felt it in the rhythm of her days, in the way she woke without heaviness and moved through her hours with intention rather than obligation. She no longer rearranged her schedule in anticipation of being needed, and that absence of waiting freed a surprising amount of energy. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, she found a box of receipts and handwritten notes from decades earlier, reminders of the years she had balanced budgets down to the last dollar, choosing practicality over comfort so Michael could have opportunities she never did. She sat on the living room floor, reading her own handwriting, steady and careful, and realized how rarely anyone had asked how much those choices had cost her. The realization did not bring bitterness, only honesty. She placed the papers back in the box and set it aside, understanding that memory could inform without controlling the present. Around the same time, Lauren's presence began to reappear indirectly, through comments Michael made during brief check-in calls, mentions of social events, of friends who admired the house, of expectations that seemed to grow rather than settle. Evelyn listened politely, noticing how often her name was absent from those narratives, and how that absence no longer felt like rejection, but like confirmation that she had stepped out of a role she was never meant to sustain. One evening, she received a message from a distant relative asking about family news, and Evelyn responded simply, stating that she was well and focusing on her own life, resisting the urge to fill the gaps with explanations. That restraint felt like strength. At the community center, she began leading a small discussion group, sharing practical advice about finances and planning, subjects she had mastered quietly over a lifetime. The women listened with interest and respect, and Evelyn felt seen in a way that did not require her to diminish herself. She spoke about preparation, about understanding the difference between generosity and self-neglect, and her words resonated more deeply than she expected. After one session, a woman thanked her for her clarity, saying it helped her make a difficult decision, and Evelyn walked home with a lightness that surprised her. Meanwhile, Michael's visits became less frequent but more deliberate. When he did come by, he paid attention, asked questions, noticed details he had once overlooked, and Evelyn allowed the conversations to unfold without steering them. She no longer filled silences with reassurance, allowing him to sit with his own thoughts. During one visit, he mentioned that Lauren had been frustrated by Evelyn's independence, unsure how to categorize it, and Evelyn responded calmly that labels were unnecessary, that boundaries often confuse those accustomed to access. Michael nodded, absorbing the idea slowly. As weeks turned into months, Evelyn noticed how her absence from the mansion altered dynamics she did not fully see but sensed nonetheless. Invitations were extended and declined with equal calm. She did not rush to attend gatherings that felt performative, choosing instead to invest her time where it was reciprocated naturally. On a quiet Sunday morning, she sat by her window watching neighbors tend their gardens, and she reflected on how much of her life had been shaped by the expectation that love required endurance. That belief had guided her faithfully for many years, but it no longer served her. She understood now that dignity was not something granted by others, but maintained by oneself through consistent choice. The laughter that once echoed in her mind had faded into insignificance, replaced by a steady awareness of her own worth. Evelyn rose from her chair, feeling grounded and certain, and moved forward into her day with the calm assurance of someone who had finally reclaimed her place, not in anyone else's house, but firmly within her own life. By the time autumn arrived, Evelyn felt fully anchored in the life she had chosen, each day reinforcing the quiet authority she now carried within herself. Leaves gathered along her sidewalk, and she swept them without hurry, aware that no one was watching and that the work belonged to her alone. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail bearing Michael's familiar handwriting, formal and careful, as if written after several drafts. Evelyn set it aside at first, finishing her tea before opening it, refusing to let anticipation rush her. The letter spoke of changes, of reflection, of pressures he had not known how to name until they began to weigh on him visibly. He wrote about realizing how often silence had replaced consideration, how he had mistaken comfort for fairness, and how he was beginning to understand that success measured only by appearances demanded sacrifices he had never questioned. There was no apology spelled out plainly, but there was an acknowledgement that something had been lost and that he was unsure how to retrieve it. Evelyn folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table, absorbing its meaning without assigning it more power than it deserved. She did not feel vindicated, nor did she feel compelled to respond immediately. Instead, she went about her day, attending an afternoon workshop at the community center, where she spoke briefly about long-term planning and the importance of clarity in family relationships, her words resonating quietly among listeners who recognized themselves in her calm resolve. Later that evening, she called Michael, her voice steady, thanking him for the letter and telling him she appreciated his honesty. She did not revisit the past or recount grievances. She simply said that understanding grows when space is allowed, and that she hoped he would continue to reflect carefully on the life he was building. Michael listened, his voice subdued, and agreed. The conversation ended without promises, but without tension as well. In the following weeks, Evelyn noticed subtle shifts. Invitations from Michael came without expectation, framed as genuine offers rather than obligations. She accepted some and declined others, choosing freely, no longer measuring her value by attendance. When she did visit, she remained herself, polite but grounded, and Lauren's demeanor shifted accordingly, cautious and restrained, uncertain how to navigate a woman who no longer sought approval. Evelyn observed these interactions without satisfaction or resentment, understanding that distance had recalibrated the balance in ways confrontation never could. At home, she continued her routines, tending to her small garden, organizing her finances, and mentoring younger women who sought her practical wisdom. Each conversation reaffirmed her belief that strength does not announce itself, but accumulates through consistent, deliberate choice. One evening, as she reviewed her documents once more, she realized she felt no urge to revise them again. Everything was already aligned with her intentions. The future no longer felt like something to be managed defensively, but something to be entered deliberately. Evelyn closed the folder and placed it back in its drawer, not as a precaution now, but as a confirmation. Sitting quietly in her living room, she reflected on how easily she had once accepted roles assigned to her, how effortlessly. She had minimized herself to preserve harmony, and how unnecessary that sacrifice had been. The laughter that once echoed in someone else's house no longer held any meaning for her. It had become merely a marker, a moment that revealed what needed to change. As the evening settled around her, Evelyn felt neither triumphant nor regretful, only composed. She understood that her decision to step away had not fractured her family, but clarified it, and that clarity, though uncomfortable at first, had given her something far more enduring than approval. It had given her herself. Winter settled gently over Evelyn's neighborhood, bringing shorter days and a quieter rhythm that suited her well. She spent mornings reading by the window, afternoons volunteering or meeting friends for coffee, and evenings reflecting without regret. The choices she had made months earlier no longer felt new or fragile. They had solidified into a way of living that required no defense. One afternoon, Michael arrived again, this time without hesitation, his posture less guarded, his voice more grounded. He spoke of decisions he was reconsidering, of conversations that had not gone as planned, of the realization that admiration from others did not equal peace within himself. Evelyn listened with the same steady attention she had always given him, but without the instinct to rescue or reassure. She told him that clarity often arrives quietly, that growth is uncomfortable precisely because it asks us to see ourselves without the filters we prefer. Michael nodded, absorbing her words, and thanked her for giving him the space to arrive at them on his own. When he left, the visit felt complete, not unresolved. Days later, Evelyn received a brief message from Lauren, polite and measured, acknowledging the distance and expressing a desire for a fresh start defined by mutual respect. Evelyn read it once and replied simply that respect begins with recognition, and that she welcomed interactions grounded in honesty rather than convenience. There was no immediate response, and she did not expect one. The absence no longer unsettled her. As the weeks passed, Evelyn noticed how the story others told about her had shifted. She was no longer described as helpful or accommodating, but as independent, composed, and deliberate. The change amused her quietly. She had not sought to redefine herself publicly, yet her refusal to accept diminishment had done so naturally. At the community center, she continued to mentor, her calm authority lending confidence to those navigating similar transitions. She spoke not of conflict, but of alignment, of ensuring that one's actions reflect one's values even when it complicates relationships. One evening, as she organized old photographs, she paused over an image of herself from years earlier, standing beside Michael at his graduation, her smile proud but restrained, already accustomed to standing just outside the spotlight. She studied the photograph and felt gratitude rather than loss. That woman had done what she believed was right with the information she had then. The woman she was now knew better, and that knowledge was earned, not borrowed. On a crisp morning, Evelyn walked through her neighborhood park, watching children play and couples stroll, the world moving forward without reference to her past roles. She felt present, fully, in a way she had not before. The mansion where laughter once echoed at her expense had receded into insignificance, no longer a measure of success or belonging. It was simply a place she no longer needed to enter. As the year drew to a close, Evelyn prepared for the holidays on her own terms, inviting those who brought warmth rather than obligation, creating gatherings defined by ease rather than performance. She set the table in her modest dining area with care, not to impress, but to honor herself and those who joined her. Sitting there, surrounded by quiet conversation and genuine connection, she understood the full weight of her decision. Dignity had not been reclaimed through confrontation or withdrawal alone, but through consistent, thoughtful choice. Evelyn lifted her glass of water, her expression serene, aware that the laughter that once attempted to define her had instead revealed her strength. The life she lived now was not louder or grander than before, but it was unmistakably her own, and that truth required no audience to affirm it.